Greetings, I am Peter White, and I'm sitting here in my office, 406 Coker Hall in the Biology Department of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and it's June 2016. My subject of this short video is the relationship between native plant garden and conservation garden. This was one of the most interesting discussions of the 28 and a half years that I was director of the North Carolina Botanical Garden. When I arrived in Chapel Hill, the garden stationery announced at the bottom, "A garden of native plants." Indeed, coming to a native plant garden was one of the attractions to the job that brought me to Chapel Hill. I'm a plant ecologist, and when I was interviewed recently about what led me to accept the garden directorship here in Chapel Hill in 1986, my answer was to talk about the lake in Maine where I went in the summer as a child and how I came to see gardens as the front door to nature itself, the front door to experiences with the plant kingdom and nature in a larger sense. Gardens are diverse at small scales, colorful and attractive to insects and birds, full of biodiversity, all at a sort of encapsulated scale. But through that door, we can go to nature itself. Native plants are part of that doorway. But I also always had sensed problems that lay beneath the phrase native plant. Now, for starters, the North Carolina Botanical Garden was not then and is not now entirely a garden of native plants, though that was the dominant theme from the beginning of the garden under our founding director, Richie Bell. For instance, the herb garden, the plant family's garden, and the Coker Arboretum were all collections of both native and non-native plants. We could point to the Native American section of the herb garden as a native plant garden, of course. And we could also point to the fact that Dr. Coker himself, when he started the Coker Arboretum in 1903, he started it with wild collected southeastern trees. But still, this label, a garden of native plants, didn't feel quite right. In addition, that label itself has some problems. For instance, what is the definition of native in a changing world in which plant species change their distributions as environments change? Even our native plants came from throughout the Southeast, from mountains and coastal plain, including species found in other southeastern states but not North Carolina. And so the garden was interpreting native at a larger geographic scale. Also, most food plants are not native, leaving native plant gardens a bit distant from issues of food supply and sustainability. But let me jump in to say that native plants support pollinators that are in fact vital to food supply, and that's an ecosystem service that is vital to a sustainable world. Also, the distinction between native and alien can sound like insider lingo to folks. It requires education and sensitivity, and this tends to sort the audience into those who understand from those who don't. I never liked barriers and wanted our message to be accessible and alluring to everyone. And then the words like native versus alien can be loaded terms in human society, creating a sense of difference and the separateness among people. In the 1990s, we were also dealing with a series of issues that helped define the conservation garden: the invasive species issue, the conservation of endangered plants through germplasm, seed banks, the protection of natural areas, the importance of biodiversity as a conservation topic, and the issue of sustainability itself. The invasive issue. Now, you can draw the line between natives and exotics, as that line was drawn in the early 1990s. But all exotics cause problems, so the test of conservation gardening becomes not native versus exotic, but invasive versus non-invasive. The garden under the first director, Richie Bell, and assistant director Ken Moore, knew right away that growing native plants meant that we had to support the conservation of those species in the wild. Early on at the garden, there was a sense of giving back to nature. This took the form of conservation through propagation and came to include the garden as a seed bank to maintain the genetic diversity of endangered southeastern species as a last resort against extinction in the wild, and to use those collections for reintroduction and restoration of wild populations. From the beginning, the garden protected natural areas, not blank spots on a map, but the protection of wild places, of nature's own gardens. This meant that the garden was a gateway to nature itself. During the 1990s, there was also an increasing emphasis on biodiversity in the conservation world. It has been noted, for example, that gardens have more insect species than plant species, one estimate being 5 insect species for each plant species, causing one conservation gardener to claim that gardens should be called insectariums. And finally, issues of sustainability for the human-environment relationship have taken center stage. Many aspects of gardening should be seen as sustainability issues: water use, toxic chemical use, renewable sources of energy, conservation of biodiversity, ecosystem services like pollinators and protecting water supplies. In a larger philosophical sense, what about the distinction between what is natural and what is human? In The Land Ethic, Aldo Leopold argues that we need to include people in the equation, that we are part of nature, albeit a species that has large and self-destructive negative effects that need to be reversed. People-dominated places and wild places are part of one continuum. Both ends of this continuum are with us, and both are needed. So all of these issues were in the air and under discussion at the North Carolina Botanical Garden in the 1990s. In 1996, I published an article in the Public Garden entitled "In Search of the Conservation Garden," and the phrase "a conservation garden" became part of our stationery and part of our entry sign, carved on wood from a red cedar tree that fell on garden land during Hurricane Fran in 1996. In short, native plants are essential but not sufficient to what gardens should be doing. Native plant is a label that stands for something deeper and more important than nativeness itself. Many gardeners who use that label, I think, are using it as a kind of shorthand for these larger issues. The native plant phrase does stand for good things. Whenever I think of that phrase at the North Carolina Botanical Garden, I think of Richie Bell's colorful wildflowers, crowded in his wildflower book and crowded here in the display beds of the North Carolina Botanical Garden that he started here in Chapel Hill. The conservation garden keeps the diversity of North Carolina plants at its heart, but it was essential to me that we defined that mission more completely. Thanks.